welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. The previous 2 Wednesdays, we've looked at a bit of the book of First Maccabees, which is written in the 2nd century BC, and it details the revolution of the Maccabeans, along with the rest of the Jews that they gathered to them against Antiochus Epiphanes and his generals who were ruling in the land of Judah at the time. And part of what we looked at with that is how Antiochus Epiphanes had come and desecrated the temple, which had been rebuilt after Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it. And then Judas Maccabeus and his army recapture the temple and they rededicate it. And that gives us a lot of background for the time of Jesus, which is coming up not too long after this. That those events were in the 160s BC, and so Jesus is fairly close relatively and historically. So it gives us much closer background to some of the other events of the Old Testament, which were a couple hundred years before. So it's a really interesting look at part of what is going into the social mindset and the culture of Jesus's day. It also teaches us a bit about what people were expecting when it came to a Messiah. Now, Judas Maccabeus is not necessarily considered a Messiah or a messianic figure, but the Jews were looking for liberation. They were looking for someone to lead them. And Judas Maccabeus does this and raises an army. And so there was a real expectation that an army would be raised. So this week, we're going to shift to a different bit of ancient literature that's almost contemporary with First Maccabees. They're roundabout, and they come from a similar time period and a similar group, and that is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hopefully many of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or maybe even remember hearing about their discovery and as they have been published over the last few decades. It were scrolls found in jars, in short, in caves around the Dead Sea there in Israel. And they were just really well preserved for the most part, though some haven't really survived, obviously. But there were tons of manuscripts preserved in these caves because of the natural conditions in terms of the dryness and everything else. They were preserved really, really well for thousands of years without being found. And they provide an incredible amount of historical insight for the time period. So about 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they've found and opened and been able to translate, about 40% of those are from the Hebrew Bible. They're books of the Old Testament or scraps of the Old Testament. And this is really interesting because although the Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole are written in a mix of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, what the Dead Sea Scrolls provided was ancient Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, whereas before, the Hebrew manuscripts that we had at the time of the discovery were from the 10th century CE, or the 900s. Now we have one or two they're a little bit older than that, but even still, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us Hebrew texts of the Old Testament that were almost 1,000 years or about 1,000 years older than anything we had had before. The other bits of the Old Testament that we did have were in Greek from the Septuagint, and those were quite old, and those corresponded really well. But in terms of the Hebrew manuscripts, because the tradition was if a Hebrew scroll of the Old Testament was ever damaged or anything like that happened, a copy would be made, and then that old scroll would be destroyed as a way to honor it and not have tattered manuscripts, because that was seen as disrespectful. So because of that tradition of making a copy and then destroying the old manuscripts, we didn't have anything very old. But the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that date from the 2nd century CE, around the 160s into the 100s. So that was a really incredible discovery. But then around 30% of the text, so 40% are Old Testament books, 30% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are other ancient literature from the time period that we have also elsewhere. So books like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Tobit, a couple other Psalms that had been preserved. We have copies of those manuscripts that we've archaeologically discovered in other places other than just the Dead Sea Scrolls. but they're still really interesting to find. And then the last 30% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are new manuscripts, previously unknown documents that are from a sectarian group of Jews who went out to live in the desert on their own, away from everybody. And this is really interesting. We don't know exactly who they were historically. We have some information about a group called the Essenes, which is the most likely name for the group that they are, though we don't know for sure that they are the Essenes. Other ancient historians mention a group called the Essenes that were a sectarian sect that withdrew from society and lived in kind of the region of the Dead Sea. But what we have in these 30% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are books about the community. There's a large book called the Community Rule. There's a book called the War Scroll and Rule of Blessing. And it's a lot of just basically, here's how our community is going to function. Here are the rules. And there are different rules about when you could leave and when you could come back, and the different ritual cleansings you had to do if you returned, and all of those sorts of things. And so those are really, really interesting for giving us insight into ancient life, and specifically this Jewish sect that was living off on their own in the desert. And so that's really, really interesting historically. It's just a treasure trove of information about a community of people from the ancient world. But one of the other really interesting scraps that they found is called, the technical name is 4Q246, which corresponds to Cave 4, which was a Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the massive halls of really important texts, because some caves had, one or two, or maybe some scraps and weren't even legible, but the fourth cave, as they designated it, had tons of stuff in it. And so this text called 4Q246, or in a much easier to remember name, is called the Son of God text. And this text is hugely interesting for understanding or giving some insight into what maybe certain Jewish sects at the time were expecting of a Messiah. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to refer to a messianic sort of figure, but I'm going to read the first half of it and tell me or see if it sounds familiar to you of some other bits of the Bible, specifically bits that are talking about Jesus or foretelling the coming of Jesus as Messiah. So this is from the Son of God text. He will be called the Son of God. They will call him the Son of the Most High, but like the meteors that you saw in your vision, so will be their kingdom. They will reign only a few years over the land, while people tramples people, nation tramples nation, until the people of God arise. Then all will have rest from warfare. Their kingdom will be an eternal kingdom, and their paths will be righteous. They will judge the land justly, and all nations will make peace. Warfare will cease from the land, and all the nations shall do obeisance to them. The great God will be their help. He himself will fight for them, putting peoples into their power, overthrowing them all before him. God's rule will be an eternal rule, and all the depths of the earth are his. And then the text goes on a little bit more, but it's a small scrap of paper, and we're missing some of it. But you can hear in some of the language about this idea of a Son of God figure coming, being almost God himself to raise an army to fight, to rule over the nations. God will help. He will fight for them, and all of that sort of thing. And it's fascinating to see what they expected, and it is very similar language to that of the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament, some even of the Gospels, or even Revelation. But also what you see here is perhaps an expectation of a physical war to be fought. And part of this sectarian group that was removing themselves from society, their expectation was that something would happen to bring God back. They thought they were, restoring the kingdom by being the true Israel out in the desert. So it's really fascinating to see these bits of paper and to see that it isn't just that the Old Testament exists in a vacuum and then somehow we get to Jesus without other things happening in the world. the existence of texts like the Son of God text from the Dead Sea Scrolls give us insight into the various expectations. And if there are groups like the Essenes, and if the Essenes are this group that have produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have expectations of who the Messiah will be, what will happen, how God will act on behalf of God's people. And the Pharisees had their expectations, and the Sadducees had their expectations. And when we looked at First Maccabees, we can see that there are some Jews who just allied with the Gentiles and let go of their traditions, and other Jews held strong to the traditions and chose to fight for them. Jesus enters into a swirling vortex of culture and expectations and all sorts of things going on with the world politically and socially and culturally. And it really is, I think, really fascinating to see how all of these pieces start to fit together and give us a really, I think, colorful and 3D image of the world Jesus is in. It's not as plain and simple and serene as maybe some of the visions we have of Jesus from childhood stories would tell us. I think it's a world of intrigue and danger and fascination and all sorts of things swirling about with groups like the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls 2,000 years ago. There's a whole lot more that can be said about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Obviously, go and have a read about them, or I'm sure you can find in an encyclopedia or something. Any normal encyclopedia will probably have something about the Dead Sea Scrolls in it. It's a hugely fascinating historical discovery, probably one of the most important historical and archaeological discoveries in especially the modern era, along with something like the discovery of King Tut's tomb. It is that impactful historically, and it gave us so much information about the Bible and about the world that Jesus enters into. So thank you for joining me on this little journey to the Dead Sea to discover some scrolls and have a read of something maybe a bit different for us. But thank you for joining us. We'll continue again next week with something a little bit different to help us, again, have a picture painted in our minds of the world that Jesus entered into. So thanks, everyone. Have a great week.